Officer Michael Roberts had been patrolling the streets of Westwood for over 2 decades. The town was a quiet, suburban area on the outskirts of a bustling American city, filled with tree-lined streets and families living the middle-class dream. Most of the houses were well-kept, with manicured lawns and basketball hoops mounted on garages, offering a picturesque snapshot of suburban life. But Michael knew better than to let appearances deceive him. Over the years, he had seen how darkness could lurk even in the brightest corners. His job had taught him that crime didn't have a set address. It could happen anywhere. As Michael sat in his patrol car that Tuesday afternoon, the radio softly hummed with dispatch updates, none of which seemed urgent. He sipped his coffee, the warmth momentarily easing the stiffness in his fingers from years of holding a badge and gun. His routine consisted of endless hours behind the wheel, scanning the streets for anything out of the ordinary. Most days were uneventful, a far cry from the adrenaline-pumping shifts he used to crave as a rookie. But Michael wasn't complaining. His years of experience had honed his instincts. He could sense when something wasn't right. He glanced at the rearview mirror and adjusted his cap, revealing streaks of gray in his hair and a weary face that had seen too much. His wife often reminded him to retire, to take a step back and enjoy life before the job consumed him. But he wasn't ready to leave the streets just yet. "There's always one more day," he would tell her. Today, as the sun began to set over the quiet neighborhood, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this particular patrol might be different. His gut told him to stay alert, and his gut had rarely been wrong. As Officer Michael Roberts drove slowly through one of the quieter residential streets, something caught his eye. A young boy, no older than 8 or 9, was walking with an older teenager, maybe in his late teens. The boy was small and slight, wearing a red hoodie that hung loosely on his tiny frame. The older boy, by contrast, was tall and muscular, with a shaved head and tattoos peeking out from the sleeves of his black jacket. At first glance, it might have seemed like a normal enough scene. Perhaps they were brothers or neighbors. But there was something in the boy's body language that set off alarms in Michael's mind. The boy glanced up at the police car, his eyes wide, almost startled. For a brief second, their eyes met through the tinted glass of the cruiser. That moment was enough for Michael to notice the nervous energy in the boy's face, the way he slightly recoiled as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't. The older teenager placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him along the sidewalk with just enough force to make the gesture look less than friendly. Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Something's off," he muttered to himself, shifting in his seat to get a better view. He knew that look in the kid's eyes. It was fear. Not the kind that came from seeing a police officer. No, this was different. The boy was scared of the person he was with, and that realization made Michael's pulse quicken. His years on the force had taught him to trust these instincts. He had seen far too many cases where small, seemingly innocent situations had turned out to be anything but. Michael reached for his radio but paused, unsure of what exactly to report. Nothing overtly illegal was happening. There was no crime in a kid walking with an older boy. But his intuition told him there was more to this than met the eye. He decided to keep watching, lowering the volume on the radio and following the pair from a distance, careful not to draw attention. The boy's behavior had triggered something deep within him, a sense of protectiveness that made it impossible to just drive away. Officer Michael Roberts kept a steady distance from the pair as they moved down the quiet street. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, giving the neighborhood a calm, almost peaceful appearance. Yet, the tension inside the patrol car was palpable. Michael's years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and everything about this situation screamed that something wasn't right. He watched as the older boy, who couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, kept a tight grip on the young child's shoulder. The boy's small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of that hand. His pace hurried, almost stumbling to keep up with the teenager's long strides. Every few steps, the younger boy would glance back nervously, his eyes darting towards the police cruiser as if silently pleading for help. Michael's mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be a family matter? A runaway? Or something more sinister like trafficking or abduction? He couldn't be sure, but he also couldn't let this go. His heart pounded with the weight of uncertainty. For a brief moment, he considered pulling over and confronting the pair immediately. But without any clear evidence, there was the risk of escalating the situation unnecessarily. Michael had learned long ago that sometimes stepping in too early could make things worse. If the older boy was dangerous, he could spook him, and the child might get hurt. Or worse. Michael didn't have enough information yet, and making the wrong move could cost the boy more than just his freedom. Instead, he decided to follow them discreetly. His patrol car slowed down, keeping several car lengths between him and the pair. Michael switched off the cruiser's lights, not wanting to alert them to his presence. As they walked further, the neighborhood began to shift subtly, transitioning from manicured lawns and two-story homes to a more run-down area with boarded-up buildings and overgrown yards. The air seemed to thicken with unease, the peaceful facade of the suburban street quickly dissolving. His radio crackled softly with background noise, but Michael kept the volume low, his eyes glued to the pair. He knew he was gambling now. If this was nothing, he'd be wasting valuable time. But if his instincts were right, and the boy was in real danger, staying back and observing could be the only way to understand what was happening. The further they walked, the more pronounced the tension became. Officer Roberts could see the younger boy's discomfort growing with every step. His head remained down, his feet dragging as though he was reluctant to continue. Occasionally, he would glance back, his wide eyes betraying an increasing sense of desperation. The older boy, however, was rigid, his steps quick and determined, as if he were on a mission. The street they were walking down had grown quieter, fewer cars passing by, and the occasional pedestrian seemed to keep their distance, either unaware of or indifferent to the unease radiating from the pair. Michael tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The once bright, suburban atmosphere had given way to something darker. Graffiti-tagged walls, abandoned houses with broken windows, and vacant lots overtaken by weeds. They were heading into an area where trouble could easily brew unnoticed. Michael's stomach tightened as he watched the boy's subtle attempts to stall, his movements growing more hesitant. The older boy gave a quick, harsh tug on the boy's arm, forcing him forward. It wasn't a casual nudge anymore. It was a sign of control, a move designed to assert dominance. Michael could see it clearly now. The older teen didn't just want to hurry him along. He wanted to make sure the boy had no choice but to obey. "Come on, man, let's go," the older boy muttered. His voice too low for Michael to hear, but clear enough in his tone. It was a command, not a request. Michael's heartbeat quickened. He'd seen enough. The behavior, the fear in the boy's eyes. It all screamed that something was wrong. But still, Michael hesitated to intervene. What if he was wrong? What if it was just an overprotective older brother being too rough? The boy's next move erased all doubt. As they reached an intersection leading to a more isolated area, the young boy tried to stop, planting his feet firmly on the ground. "I don't want to go," the boy shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Michael heard it, even through the closed windows of his car. The older boy yanked him hard, jerking him forward. "Shut up. You don't have a choice," the older teen snapped, his voice loud and angry now, echoing down the nearly empty street. Michael's hands clenched, the decision clear. This wasn't just an argument between siblings. The boy's desperation, his attempt to resist. It was a cry for help. Michael's pulse quickened, and his mind raced. He had to act soon, but the situation was delicate. One wrong move, and the older boy could panic, possibly hurting the child. The tension in the air was thick, the stakes higher than ever. He couldn't wait any longer. Michael slowly reached for his radio, keeping his eyes on the pair, ready to call for backup if things escalated further. But even as he prepared for the worst, his thoughts kept racing. Was he about to step into a situation that would change everything? As Officer Roberts gripped the radio in his hand, he hesitated, caught in a moment of indecision. His instincts screamed at him to act, to pull over and intervene before things got worse. But a small voice in the back of his mind warned him to be careful, to avoid jumping to conclusions too quickly. What if this wasn't what it seemed? What if he was about to ruin someone's life for no reason? Michael's eyes flicked between the two figures on the sidewalk. The younger boy was still resisting, his small frame trembling as he tried to pull away from the older teen's grip. The older boy, now visibly frustrated, had tightened his hold, muttering harshly under his breath. The entire scene felt wrong, like a dangerous current pulling them all into something darker, something irreversible. He could feel the weight of his badge pressing against his chest, a symbol of responsibility. If he acted too soon, without all the facts, he could escalate a situation that might have been resolved with just a few words. But if he waited too long, if this really was something dangerous, it could cost the boy his safety, or worse, his life. Michael's thoughts raced. In his 20 years on the force, he had seen this moment play out many times. That fine line between action and inaction. Each time, he had to make a judgment call, one that could have lasting consequences. He quickly considered his options. He could continue to follow them and wait for more confirmation that something illegal or harmful was happening. But that would risk losing them if they disappeared into one of the dilapidated buildings ahead. He could also call for backup now, but doing so might take time. And if things escalated quickly, he might regret not acting sooner. The young boy let out another small cry, his voice tinged with panic, as the older boy shoved him toward an alleyway just ahead. The narrow alley was dark, with piles of trash bags lining the sides and a tall, rusted chain-link fence at the end. It was the kind of place where things happened without witnesses, where the world turned its back. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, the thumping sound almost drowning out the hum of his patrol car's engine. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline coursing through him. This was it. He had to make a decision. He could see the older boy speaking to the younger one, though the words were lost to the distance. The older boy gestured toward the alley, his body language becoming more aggressive, more urgent. The younger boy, now visibly shaking, seemed frozen in place, his eyes darting around for some way out. Michael's fingers hovered over the radio once more. One call could bring backup in minutes, but would it be too late? He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. Time was slipping away, and the longer he waited, the higher the stakes became. Suddenly, the older boy turned around, his eyes briefly scanning the street behind him. Michael immediately ducked slightly in his seat, ensuring the patrol car remained unnoticed. The moment passed, and the older boy returned his focus to the younger one. Michael's breath caught in his throat. If he waited even a minute longer, the boy might be led into the alley and out of sight. He had no choice now. He had to act. Taking a deep breath, Michael finally made his decision. He reached for his radio and spoke into it, his voice calm but urgent. "This is Officer Roberts. I'm on Westwood Street following a possible abduction. I need backup immediately. Suspects are heading into an alley off Oakwood. Approach with caution." He put the radio down and shifted his car into gear, ready to confront the pair. His mind was racing, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let that boy disappear without doing everything in his power to stop it. The patrol car came to a quiet stop just outside the alleyway, where the neighborhood's clean streets gave way to a darker, more abandoned stretch of urban decay. Officer Michael Roberts turned off the engine, his eyes fixed on the scene ahead. The boy and the older teenager had vanished into the narrow alley, a place where the streetlights barely reached and shadows crept up the cracked walls of the old buildings. The alley was an unsettling place, lined with overflowing trash bins, graffiti-splattered walls, and the stench of neglect that permeated the air. It was the kind of area where people rarely ventured by choice, and Michael knew that if anything went down here, it would be out of sight from the rest of the world. His instincts were now screaming that something was very wrong. He stepped out of the car, taking care to close the door softly, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered gun. There was a fine line between control and chaos, and he was walking it now. Every sense was heightened, his pulse quickening as he moved closer to the mouth of the alley. Ahead, he could see the older boy gripping the younger one's arm tightly, pulling him deeper into the alley. The small boy stumbled over the uneven ground, his face pale, and Michael could almost feel the fear radiating off of him. The older boy glanced around, his eyes darting back and forth as though checking if anyone was watching. Michael knew he had to act, but he also knew rushing in could escalate the situation. He crouched slightly, moving forward as quietly as possible, making sure to stay out of their immediate line of sight. The alley led to a dead end fenced by rusted metal, and a sense of urgency gripped him. They had nowhere else to go, and that could make the older boy desperate. The air was thick with tension as Michael crept closer. He could hear muffled voices now, the older boy speaking in harsh, hurried tones to the younger one. The boy's voice trembled, though Michael couldn't make out the words. He caught a glimpse of the older boy's face, a scowl of frustration as he tugged on the boy's arm, trying to coerce him into something. "Please, I don't want to go," the boy whimpered, his voice barely above a whisper. The older boy snapped back, his voice low but venomous. "Shut up. You don't have a choice." That was it. Michael couldn't wait any longer. His gut had told him this was bad from the start, and now he had all the confirmation he needed. His hand hovered over his radio, but he knew that calling for backup now might take too long. The boy was in immediate danger, and every second counted. Michael stepped out of the shadows, his voice strong and commanding. "Police, step away from the boy." The older boy whipped around, startled by the sudden presence of the officer. His eyes widened for a split second before narrowing, sizing up the situation. He kept his grip on the boy's arm, but Michael could see the fear flicker in his eyes. This wasn't a seasoned criminal. This was a kid himself, someone who was in over his head. "Let him go," Michael said, his hand now resting on the grip of his gun, though he prayed he wouldn't have to use it. Right now. The older boy hesitated, his body tense, torn between fight and flight. He took a small step back, his gaze shifting from the boy to Michael and back again. For a moment, the alley was deathly silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on all of them. The young boy, still trembling, looked at Michael with a mixture of hope and terror. He was frozen in place, too scared to move, too scared to speak. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "Let him go, and we'll figure this out." Another beat of silence passed, and then, with a sudden shove, the older boy pushed the young boy away from him. The child stumbled forward, almost falling but catching himself at the last second. Michael took a step forward, placing himself between the two, his hands still ready in case things turned violent. "Stay where you are," Michael warned the older boy, his eyes locked onto him, not allowing a single movement to go unnoticed. The older boy clenched his fists, his jaw tight, but he didn't move. He knew he was caught. Michael's radio crackled softly, the voice of dispatch breaking through the tension, but Michael didn't reach for it. He had the situation under control, for now. The young boy, still shaking, looked up at Michael, his eyes filled with silent gratitude. For the first time since this had all started, he was safe. But the story wasn't over yet. Officer Michael Roberts kept his eyes trained on the older boy, who stood frozen in place at the far end of the alley. His instincts told him that the boy was dangerous, but there was something else, something more complicated, about the way he was behaving. The fear in his eyes wasn't just of being caught. It was something deeper, a fear of consequences that went beyond a run-in with the police. As Michael kept his hand near his weapon, he slowly crouched down, making eye contact with the younger boy. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, his voice soft but urgent. He didn't want to spook the kid any further. The boy, trembling from head to toe, nodded slowly but didn't speak. His face was pale, his eyes darting between Michael and the older boy, clearly terrified of what might happen next. Michael could sense the complexity of the situation deepening with every second that passed. He kept his gaze steady on the older teen, trying to gauge his next move. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice firmer now. "Why are you dragging this kid around? Talk to me." For a moment, the older boy didn't respond. His fists clenched at his sides, and his breathing was heavy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke in a low, almost broken voice. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered, barely audible at first. "They told me I had to do this." Michael frowned, stepping closer to the young boy to shield him from whatever might come next. "What do you mean, they told you? Who's making you do this?" The older teen's body seemed to deflate, the bravado and aggression melting away as he sank against the wall of the alley. I owe them. Money. A lot of money," he said, his voice shaking now. "They said if I didn't bring him, they'd come after my family." The weight of the words hit Michael like a punch in the gut. He had seen situations like this before. Gangs, drug dealers, or worse, preying on vulnerable kids and using them to do their dirty work. The older boy wasn't just a thug. He was caught in something much bigger and darker, something that had forced him to become part of a nightmare far beyond his control. Michael's attention shifted back to the young boy, who was still staring wide-eyed at the older teenager. "Is that true?" Michael asked the boy gently, kneeling down to meet his eyes. "Did he hurt you?" The boy shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes, but he still didn't speak. Michael's heart ached as he watched the boy struggle to keep it together. He had to be no older than 8, far too young to be mixed up in something like this. Michael had seen hardened criminals break down under pressure, but seeing a child in the middle of this, terrified and powerless, was something that hit him on a level he hadn't felt in years. "Listen," Michael said softly to the young boy. "You're safe now, okay? No one's going to hurt you. We're going to take care of this." The boy nodded again, this time letting out a soft sob as the tears spilled over. Michael felt his own throat tighten. He had spent his entire career dealing with hardened criminals, addicts, and violent offenders, but this was different. This wasn't just about stopping a crime. This was about saving a life that had barely begun. Michael stood up and turned back to the older boy, who was now sitting on the ground, his head in his hands. "I'm calling for backup," Michael said, pulling out his radio. "But I need you to tell me everything. Who are they? Where were you taking him?" The older boy hesitated, clearly torn between fear and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, telling the truth would save him from whatever fate was waiting on the other side of this mess. His voice cracked as he finally spoke. They run a trafficking ring. Kids. They promised me if I delivered him, my debt would be cleared. But I couldn't do it." He looked up at Michael with tear-filled eyes, his tough exterior completely shattered. "I swear, I was going to let him go. I didn't want to do this." The weight of the revelation hit Michael like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a case of bullying or coercion. This was something far more sinister. The young boy had been targeted by a human trafficking ring, and the older teen had been manipulated into becoming a pawn in their game. Michael's stomach churned at the thought of what could have happened if he hadn't trusted his gut and followed them into the alley. He fought to keep his emotions in check, but the gravity of the situation was overwhelming. For years, Michael had seen the worst of humanity, but this was something else, a darkness that preyed on the most vulnerable. It took everything in him to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over as he looked at the boy, who was still shaking but now safe. Michael's voice was steady as he radioed for immediate backup. "This is Officer Roberts. I need all available units at Oakwood Alley, possible human trafficking situation. Suspects are armed and dangerous. I need medical personnel for a young boy, possibly traumatized. Situation under control for now, but send help fast." As the radio crackled with confirmation, Michael turned back to the two boys, one a victim, the other a reluctant accomplice, and felt the full weight of what had just been revealed. It wasn't just another day on the job. This would stay with him for a long, long time. As the weight of the revelation settled over Officer Roberts, a deep, overwhelming sadness began to well up inside him. He had dealt with tough cases before. He had seen violence, abuse, and the impact of the drug trade. But something about this situation hit him in a way that years of hardened experience couldn't protect him from. The sight of the small, terrified boy, standing helplessly in the alley, pulled at his heart. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a tragedy unfolding in real time. The boy, still standing a few feet away, had finally collapsed into a quiet sobbing. His small hands were shaking, and his body trembled as though it could no longer hold up under the weight of fear and confusion. Michael's instincts as a cop kicked in. Stay calm, stay professional. But another part of him, the human part, felt something deeper. This was a child, a boy who had been minutes away from disappearing into the dark world of trafficking, a world that would have swallowed him whole without a second thought. Michael crouched down again, this time more gently, and reached out, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's okay now," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. I promise you, no one's going to hurt you." The boy wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie but didn't say anything. His tears continued to fall, but the quiet sobs told Michael more than words could have. It was the kind of pain that no child should ever have to endure, a weight far too heavy for such young shoulders to carry. Michael's own chest tightened, and he could feel the tears burning behind his eyes. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it wasn't enough. For the first time in years, Officer Michael Roberts, the veteran with 2 decades on the force, felt his eyes fill with tears. He blinked hard, trying to push them back, but it was no use. The emotion hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he let it wash over him. All the hardened layers of his experience, the things that had helped him keep his distance from the pain and suffering of the world, were stripped away in this one heartbreaking moment. "God," Michael whispered under his breath, his voice barely audible. He turned his head slightly, wiping the corner of his eyes with the back of his hand, hoping the boy hadn't noticed. But the truth was, he couldn't hold it together anymore. The emotional toll of what had nearly happened here, and the innocence that had been stolen from this child, was too much. He wasn't just an officer now. He was a father, a protector, and a witness to something that no child should ever have to experience. Behind him, the older boy, now sitting on the ground with his knees pulled to his chest, was crying too. His tough exterior had crumbled completely, and for the first time since this ordeal had begun, Michael could see the raw fear and guilt on his face. The older boy wasn't just an accomplice in a crime. He was a victim too, trapped in a cycle of violence and desperation that had led him down this path. "I didn't want to hurt him," the older boy choked out, his voice breaking. "I swear, I didn't. I just didn't know what else to do." Michael stood up slowly, his heart heavy with the complexity of it all. This wasn't a simple case of good versus bad, of criminal versus victim. The older boy had been pulled into something far bigger than he could handle, and now, both of these boys, one much younger, one only a few years older, were standing at the edge of a nightmare. The tears were still threatening to spill over as Michael reached for his radio again, his voice quieter now. "Dispatch, I need immediate medical assistance. Both individuals are stable but traumatized. No injuries, but they'll need psychological support. I'll stay with them until backup arrives." As he clipped the radio back onto his belt, Michael turned back to the 2 boys. The young one had finally sunk to the ground, his back against the cold, dirty alley wall, his head resting on his knees. The older boy, still sitting against the opposite wall, was looking down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Both of them were broken in different ways, and Michael felt a deep sense of sorrow for what had happened to them. Michael walked over to the young boy, crouching down once more. "Hey," he said softly, "it's going to be okay. I'm not going anywhere, all right? I'm going to stay with you." The boy didn't respond, but he leaned slightly toward Michael, a small, instinctual gesture of trust. It was enough to break whatever walls Michael had left. He let out a slow, shaky breath, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The tears came quietly, 1 or 2 at a time, as he sat with the boy in the silence of the alley, waiting for help to arrive. Michael knew that this moment would stay with him for a long time. He had seen a lot in his career, things that most people never would, but this was different. This was a wound that would take a long time to heal, both for the boys and for himself. And as he sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on him, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of responsibility. He had saved a life today, but the scars left behind were deep, and they would take time to heal. As the reality of the situation fully sank in, Officer Michael Roberts knew he couldn't handle this alone. His years of experience had taught him how to manage tense and dangerous situations, but this was different. It wasn't just about apprehending a suspect or breaking up a violent altercation. This was about lives that had already been shattered, about 2 boys caught in a system of exploitation and fear. Michael could feel the weight of it bearing down on his shoulders as he stood up and reached for his radio once again. "Dispatch," he called, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I need backup immediately. Situation involves a potential trafficking case. 2 minors. Both need medical and psychological assistance. I'm requesting a trauma response team." The radio crackled to life with the dispatcher's reply. "Roger that, Officer Roberts. Backup is on the way. ETA 5 minutes." Michael let out a slow breath. 5 minutes felt like an eternity in moments like this, but he knew he had to keep everything under control until then. He glanced back at the older boy, who had pulled his knees to his chest, his head hanging low as he sat against the grimy alley wall. The raw guilt and fear in his expression were palpable, and Michael could tell that despite his role in the situation, the teen was just as trapped as the young boy had been. Michael walked over to him, crouching down but maintaining a safe distance, his voice calm yet firm. "What's your name?" he asked, knowing that creating a connection, even a small one, might help diffuse the tension further. The older boy hesitated before responding, his voice barely above a whisper. "Derek," he stammered, wiping his tear-streaked face with the sleeve of his jacket. I didn't want to do this." Michael nodded, understanding the gravity of Derek's situation. He was just a kid, pulled into something far bigger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. But that didn't change the fact that he had nearly delivered another child into that same world of darkness. Still, the law didn't always see shades of gray, and Michael knew Derek's life would never be the same after today. "You're in trouble, Derek," Michael said, his voice steady but not unkind. "But right now, I need you to stay calm and cooperate, okay? You've already taken a step in the right direction by stopping. That's something. But there's more you need to tell us. Who are these people? Who's behind this?" Derek swallowed hard, his eyes still fixed on the ground. "I don't know their names," he admitted, his voice shaky. "I never met them face to face. They just told me what to do through texts and calls. I'm just supposed to take the kids to a place, drop them off, and that's it." Michael's stomach twisted at the thought of how organized and calculated this operation was. Trafficking rings often worked in this way, disconnected layers of individuals, each playing a small but crucial part, making it harder to trace the operation back to the people at the top. Derek was just a cog in the machine, but the boy he had nearly taken was the one who would have paid the ultimate price. "And the place?" Michael pressed. "Where were you supposed to take him?" Derek hesitated again, clearly torn between fear of the people who had forced him into this and the guilt of what he had nearly done. Finally, he exhaled shakily. "There's an old warehouse near the industrial park. I've only been there once, but it's where they told me to go. I don't know what happens after that. I swear." Michael nodded, filing the information away. He'd relay it to the backup team when they arrived. But for now, his focus was on keeping the situation calm and safe. Derek was scared, and Michael could see that the boy was on the verge of breaking down completely. He needed to be handled carefully, not as a hardened criminal, but as a victim in a web of manipulation and exploitation. The younger boy, meanwhile, had curled up against the opposite wall of the alley, still trembling. Michael's heart ached for him. This child had been moments away from disappearing, and the thought of how close they had come to losing him forever was almost too much to bear. But now wasn't the time to dwell on what could have been. He needed to keep both boys safe, physically and emotionally, until more help arrived. Just then, Michael heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. Relief washed over him, though he knew this was only the beginning. Backup meant more officers, but it also meant media attention, investigations, and potentially a long, drawn-out process that would take its toll on both boys. For now, though, they were safe, and that was what mattered most. "Derek," Michael said, standing up and keeping his tone calm but direct, "when the other officers get here, I need you to be straight with them. Don't lie. Don't try to cover anything up. It'll only make things harder. You understand?" Derek nodded numbly, his body sagging as though the weight of what he had been through was finally too much to bear. A few seconds later, the first police car pulled up to the mouth of the alley, followed by an ambulance and a second patrol car. Michael waved them over, stepping back slightly to let the paramedics and fellow officers take over. As the medical team rushed to the young boy, checking him for any physical injuries and preparing to take him to the hospital for evaluation, Michael stepped aside, finally allowing himself to breathe. The older boy, Derek, was placed in handcuffs, not roughly, but as a necessary step in the procedure, before being led away by another officer. Michael watched as the two boys, both victims in their own way, were taken from the scene. He had done his part, but the feeling of helplessness still lingered. There was so much more to this story, so many layers of pain, fear, an exploitation that couldn't be fixed in a day or even a lifetime. But at least for now, the boys were safe. That, Michael told himself, was a small victory. The alley buzzed with activity as the last remnants of chaos began to settle. Officer Michael Roberts stood to the side, watching the paramedics as they carefully loaded the young boy into the ambulance. The sounds of bustling officers and the distant wail of sirens created a backdrop of urgency that matched the gravity of the situation. Yet, Michael felt a profound stillness within him. He understood that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, the journey ahead for both boys was fraught with complexity and challenges. As the ambulance doors slid shut, Michael caught a fleeting glimpse of the boy's face, pale and wide-eyed, still filled with fear and confusion. The paramedic spoke soothingly, reassuring him, but Michael recognized that words alone couldn't erase the trauma. This child had narrowly escaped a fate that no one should endure, and the path to healing would be long and painful. He could only hope that the medical team would provide the care and support necessary to guide the boy through the darkness that had enveloped him. Turning his attention to Derek, the older teenager, Michael observed him slumped in the back of a police cruiser, handcuffed but not violent. Derek stared blankly out of the window, his expression one of profound defeat. Michael's heart ached at the sight. Here was another victim, entangled in a world far more dangerous than he had realized. Derek hadn't been the mastermind. He had been coerced, manipulated by unseen forces that preyed on his vulnerabilities. The patrol car's door opened, and another officer approached Michael, clipboard in hand, ready to gather information. Michael took a deep breath, the exhaustion of the day weighing heavily on him. "I'll need to give my statement," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He recounted the events, how he had spotted the two boys, the gut instinct that had propelled him to follow them, and the harrowing revelation of the trafficking operation that had almost claimed the young boy's life. "Any leads on where they were taking him?" the officer asked, pen poised over the clipboard. Michael nodded, his thoughts already racing ahead. "Derek mentioned a warehouse near the industrial park. We need to get a unit over there immediately. This operation is bigger than just these two." The urgency in his tone mirrored the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins. He knew that if they didn't act quickly, other vulnerable kids could fall prey to this ring. As the officer took down the details, Michael's gaze drifted back to the cruiser. Derek was looking out at the street, a mixture of fear and guilt clouding his features. Michael approached him, the weight of their shared experience heavy in the air. "Derek," he began, trying to strike a balance between authority and compassion, "I need you to tell me everything you know. We can't let this happen to anyone else." Derek turned to face him, eyes glistening with unshed tears. I didn't mean to get involved," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I thought it was just a delivery. They said I'd be helping someone. I didn't know it was like this." Michael felt a pang of sympathy. Derek was just a kid caught in a web he didn't understand. "It's going to be okay," Michael reassured him. "You did the right thing by stopping. We'll make sure you get the help you need to." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the alley, Michael felt a shift in the atmosphere. He realized that while the physical danger had passed, the emotional and psychological battles were just beginning for both boys. Derek would have to face the consequences of his choices, but perhaps there was still a chance for redemption. A second patrol car pulled up, followed by a van from the department's Special Operations Unit. Officers poured into the alley, ready to secure the area and investigate the leads that had emerged from this harrowing encounter. Michael stepped aside, allowing them to do their work, but his mind remained focused on the immediate next steps. The warehouse Derek had mentioned was a lead, and it wouldn't be long before they began tracking down those responsible for orchestrating this operation. As he watched the new officers begin their work, Michael took a moment to reflect. This case was far from over. There were larger forces at play, an intricate network that had exploited vulnerable children and turned them into commodities. He felt a burning resolve ignite within him. He would not let this go. He would ensure that the boys would be safe and that the perpetrators behind this operation would be brought to justice. As the night deepened, Michael remained in the alley, surrounded by the cacophony of sirens and voices, feeling the weight of his role as a protector. The path ahead was daunting, but he was determined to follow it through. He had saved one life today, and he would fight to save as many others as possible. With every ounce of his being, he would see this through to the end. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's really exciting.